Yeah.
Awesome.
Yes.
Okay, so for those of you who haven't attended an Empowering Special Minds session, just a quick intro on what Empowering Minds is all about. We're a small group that's just focused on empowering and supporting parents so that parents have the tools and resources or access to the tools and resources that they need to support their neurodivergent children. My name is Ophelia. I started Empowering Special Minds this year because I have two autistic boys, ages 5 and 7. And, I had to navigate the healthcare system to figure out what the next steps need to be for my kids. And it's just dumbfounding sometimes the lack of guidance and procedures that are out there. And so my goal here is to share some of the learnings that I've come across and also meet with service providers and specialists and connect parents with these service providers and specialists on topics that are very important to learn about early on as they are starting their journey with their kids. Um, and so this year, my goal is to host a number of sessions just dealing on core topics such as therapy methods, food and nutrition, activities and resources, the schools in Calgary and Edmonton, and the kind of school systems that you need to be thinking about, and also any kind of practitioners that you could have on your team that could better support you as a parent. And so that's a little bit about me, and that's that. And so today we're talking about nutrition. What is nutrition? Why nutrition? And something I've learned along the way is before we start looking at all the things that are happening on the outside, is important to pay attention to what's going on the inside, what our kids are putting in their bodies. And that's something that, I learned later down the line that I probably wish I knew early on. And then the next question became, who do I talk to about these things? Your pediatrician, naturopath, homeopath, occupational therapist, who's the right person to talk to about all of these things? And I realized later on that, speak to a dietitian and let them talk to you about what really should be going in our bodies as individuals. And this is something that doesn't just extend to our neurodivergent kids, but also supports our neurotypical kids as well and supports us as well. And so having a foundational understanding on nutrition can be important for our lifestyle, for our health, for their health, for everybody's benefit, and for us all thriving as a community as a whole. And so today, we're so fortunate to have Amber Whitmore with us, who is a registered dietitian and a nutrition counselor, and she's the founder of Nourished Collaborative. She specializes in neurodiversity and some self-care nutritional complications that also come with that, which is great because it's very difficult to find a nutritionist or a dietitian who actually has some understanding of what's going on in neurodivergent individuals. So it's really great that we have one today who this is her core focus. She doesn't just work with kids, she works with a lot of complications that impact children, teens, young adults, and adults, but focusing on the things that start in childhood. And so I think she is going to be a great resource for us today. So thank you, Amber, and welcome.
Thank you.
So before we dive into the questions and the conversations and the dialogue, just a few housekeeping items. This session is being recorded. It'll be shared post-session via our Facebook page. If you have any questions, which is what's most important, feel free to use the chat section, or you could raise your hand if it is pertinent to the topic that we are discussing about right now. And then if you have something that you want to add to the conversation, feel free to raise your hand, or we can ask if you have any questions and you can use that time. Or better yet, wait till the end of the Q&A and then you can ask all the questions, whether it's stuff that we've talked about or stuff that we haven't mentioned, but it's very important to you that you've come here today with. Does anybody have any questions? All
Yeah.
right. Wonderful. So, with that, we're going to dive into the questions. So, Amber, I think the first question is, there's a lot of conversation, and I've mentioned it today already. Dietitian, nutritionist. What is a registered dietitian, and what is a nutritionist? What's the difference between the two?
So across all of Canada in each province, registered dietitian is a protected title, whereas nutritionist is not a protected title. So really anybody could call themselves a nutritionist. Somebody could take like a 5-hour course and call themselves a nutritionist, whereas a dietitian requires an undergraduate degree. And they just changed this year, but now they also require a master's degree in addition to a practicum, which has always been required. And then each year, because again, we're protected healthcare professionals, that each province is like governed by its own college, we have to have 3 or more different learning goals and have proof that we're continuing to increase and keep up with up-to-date like literature and nutrition information. So on average, a dietitian would have 7 or more years of schooling specializing in nutrition, and a nutritionist doesn't necessarily have to have any.
Wow, that's actually very important to know. And so there are a lot of people on Facebook, on Instagram who are promoting information and call themselves certified nutritionists. And so this helps us, I guess, kind of delineate who has more credibility behind their study and who doesn't. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. And there are like nutritionist courses. So, of course, a lot of people that are calling themselves a nutritionist, they do have some type of a certification to support that. But no matter what, it's not going to have the same years or specialization in training because, again, like dietitians actually have to go through that 4-year undergraduate degree specializing in nutrition science, have a master's, and on average for a year have to have that practicum where they're actually working with dietitians in different fields to gain that like area of expertise.
Awesome. And so, as a registered dietitian in your practice, what kind of clients do you see?
I work with a diverse client population, but when it comes to the neurodiversity, autism, ADHD, I work a lot with some parents of children, teens, and then adults or young adults who are having complications essentially with their nutritional intake and self care in general. So, a lot of the time, there's pretty similar barriers that can impact neurodiverse people with getting their nutrition needs met. And those can be related to texture barriers, struggle with executive function later in life, dysregulation, or having fear, uncertainty around trying new things, it feeling really out of control if it's something new. So, I mean, the individual barriers can be different client to client or family to family, but in general, just trying to figure out what's happening with that unique individual and trying to meet them where they're at and find strategies to overcome or work with their specific barriers to nutrition or again like self-care.
Awesome. And so we can dive now more into talking about food and the gut. Some of us were taught, every child or everybody needs to eat a balanced diet. And this is ideal nutrition. What would you define nutrition as?
I would define nutrition as like the essential building blocks that our brain and body need to function optimally. So I do like to simplify nutrition because I do think that nutrition's really overcomplicated in certain ways in our culture. So I do break it down to kind of 4 pillars, which I think most people are familiar with, right? So our proteins, our carbs, our fats, and our color. I try to get people to think of it in like a plate method. It's actually Canada's current food guide, where we're looking at proportions of food versus the old food guide, where it's like portions of each food group, which can be really overwhelming. So trying to pull consistently each day or week from these different food categories. And if anyone wants to look at the current Canada's food guide, that might be supportive as well. But I try to look at these food categories for the core nutrients that they offer us versus just arbitrarily like pulling from the food groups.
Yeah.
So like the proteins we're eating are giving us the core building blocks for our hormones and our muscles, and the pieces that we're getting from our carbs is the energy we need for our brain and body. And we're getting from fats is really important omega-3s for building neurotransmitters and for brain function and communication. And for color, it's really a lot of our micronutrients, so vitamins and minerals, which really our bodies use as kind of keys to unlock all of these processes and create, again, like hormones and muscles and everything else that our body needs to maintain and heal and grow. So to me, nutrition is going kind of to the core and back to the basics of what our brain and body need and how nutrients actually offer us that. We're really, I say we're built of nutrition in a lot of ways.
And why is it then, I guess it makes a lot of sense why we eat in the way we need to eat based on how you've broken it down. Why is there a big emphasis on this being critically important for neurodivergent children? And maybe you can also touch on, as parents, how do we even begin this journey of figuring out?
I would say, I mean, of course, it's important for every child, every person. But when we're looking maybe specifically at the population of neurodiverse kids or people, we do tend to have really hyperactive nervous systems and brains, I'll say. So a lot of the time I describe like the ADHD experience as having like 10 tabs open, right? And we're just constantly kind of surveilling the environment. That can be really common for autism too. But there's often just a lot more dysregulation happening in neurodiverse brains and nervous systems. And that does mean that we're kind of operating in what I would call like a hypermetabolic state. So the nutrient needs can, absolutely be the baseline of a human being, but sometimes actually higher, especially for certain nutrients and things like omega-3, which is so important for brain function. So I would say that's kind of maybe specific to a neurodiverse population. And what was your second question, sorry?
As parents, how do we begin the journey of figuring out how to create the right nutritional plan for our kids?
Okay. I mean, I would say kind of going back to if we try to simplify it and we're looking at that plate method, it's really based on like idealistic eating. So I don't know any neurodiverse kids or people for that matter that eat like 3 square meals. But if we try to zoom out and look at it just as like the proportions of nutrition, and it was 3 square meals, it's like half of a plate is color, a quarter is protein, and a quarter is our carb. It's kind of like a tick box for fat because the proportion of that really depends on the food. If we look at any kind of given day or week, I would just try to kind of conceptualize, are we pulling kind of, 2 color for every protein and every carb? And are we consistently, at least like a few times a day, offering a source of fat? And I would say, again, like most kids and adults that I'm working with see gaps in that, right? And so starting to identify where those gaps are. And then this is where working with a dietitian can be really supportive. It's, well, what nutrients then might be missing if we're really missing the mark with protein, let's say. Because, my kid doesn't like meat at all. The texture of it is too inconsistent and they don't like plant-based proteins. So we know, let's say amino acids are really missing in this diet. Then again, working with the dietitian can be really supportive, but also I just emphasize like meeting your kid and adult where like you're at, right? And so if this child is not getting their protein needs met through food, like through solids, how do we currently meet them where they're at? And does that look like incorporating some protein powder into like a milkshake smoothie, right? Does it look like trying to incorporate like maybe Ensure or Boost? Or does it look like, again, working around it? Sometimes it's like hiding protein in foods, but each child's different. So it's looking at kind of the overarching recommendations for the nutrients that a brain and body need as a human being, identifying where the maybe biggest gap is and working on that gap first and just taking it step by step. If that answers your question.
That does. It does. And I think that it's important that we kind of change our mind frame around it. And, we break it down into chunks of, which ones we want to introduce, how we want to go about introducing it. That wouldn't be, too hard on us parents and hard on them to also receive it, where they are more receptive of getting it in. Now, now that we've talked about what nutrition is and how we could even start looking at getting the right nutritional profile for our kids, how are the gut and brain related? There's a lot of blogs out there, a lot of comments, a lot of posters and people who talk about gut-brain connection, gut-brain connection. How is it really connected?
So for sure, our gut and our brain are like intrinsically connected. I say they talk 24/7. So our gut and our brain, they do share their own nervous system, which is one of the reasons they're communicating constantly. They communicate through the gut-brain axis. And so having a healthy gut, which we can kind of even break down what that looks like and how to support that. But a healthy gut is going to support healthy brain development and function in the same way that having like a regulated nervous system and stable mental and emotional health supports gut health. So I talk a lot to kind of try to conceptualize this about IBS, which I think most people have heard of. A lot of time IBS is diagnosed when there's no physical cause found to explain why someone is experiencing gut issues, whether it's really profound lack of appetite or nausea or constipation or loose stool. And what we know is that IBS is more of a symptom of dysregulation than it is actually a disease of the body. So thinking of it more as like a state versus a trait. And so even if a kid or a person isn't experiencing IBS symptoms, we know that that connection is constantly taking place. So trying to help really foster a healthy gut and gut microbiome, which is largely how we nourish. It also is supporting regulation for the child because it goes both ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. And so based on that, then, are you saying that before we start looking at building blocks for the brain, we have to make sure that the gut is functioning the right way to be able to process nutrients and all the things that we eat and put in there, because it really does pass some of that to our brain function. Is that what you're saying?
I think that it's I mean, it's kind of both. I think that we can look at it in terms of like we can rather than solely focusing on like the building blocks for the brain and like focusing on these other ways of fixing a behavioral issue or trying to manage the health of our child.
Mm-hmm.
If the gut is dysfunctional or we're seeing gut issues crop up, um, then there's only so much we can do in this other arena without coming back to the gut, because our health is just, it's so nuanced and multifaceted. Like, it's just so rare that there's only one thing. It's kind of like throwing a dart at a dartboard and like hoping to hit a bullseye. Like, there's just often multiple arenas or ways that we have to address everyone's health from.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense. And so another term that I think is also being passed around in communities is dysbiosis, gut dysbiosis. What does that really mean?
So gut dysbiosis is any type of disorder or lack of, I'll say, like homeostasis or health in our gut. And so that can be an overgrowth of unhealthy bacteria, or it could be a deficit in healthy bacteria. So if we're talking about the gut microbiome, it's really exists largely in our lower intestines, and it's where a lot of our probiotics exist. And our gut microbiome is very closely related, again, to our mental health. And so if there is gut dysbiosis, and we're maybe specifically focusing on a lack of healthy probiotics, then it's trying to support that through bolstering the like healthy gut microbiome with things like fiber, which are prebiotics, so they feed probiotics. But I will say too, it's really common that so many of us actually have some level of gut dysbiosis, and that's just because the current diet and environment that we're living in isn't really one that we evolved with. And so in some way, most people are eating, right, processed foods, and that is okay. That is the world we live in. In some way, a lot of people are experiencing stress, because how could you not? And all of those things affect the gut and its function. So a lot of people have gut dysbiosis, and it's just each individual doing their best to try and support their gut microbiome. Yeah.
Okay. So let's look now at, let's get into foods. One of the areas I want to start with is picky eating. It's a very common complaint I see in my mom community. I can't get my children to eat broccoli. I can't get them to eat fruit. I can't get them to eat vegetables. But if I bring chicken nuggets and fries, if I bring pizza, that's what they gravitate to.
Mm-hmm.
How do we even begin tackling this world of picky eating? Why are our kids, gravitating to some foods that probably are, ultra processed versus the healthier nutritional alternatives?
Mm-hmm. I mean, it can be different for each kid, but I'll say largely a lot of time it has to do with the predictability of certain foods. So foods that are the same every single time they eat it are things that a lot of the time certain kids with autism default to, just because there is a certain level of rigidity and a safety and predictability. Mm-hmm. So that's where sometimes like chicken nuggets, right, are really like classic go-to because they're so predictable. Can also be a lot about sensory processing and texture. So a lot of autistic kids do have issues processing certain sensory input, and that extends to like light and sound and smell, but also texture, right? And so there can be certain textures and consistencies and smells of food that some kids find really palatable, and then there's others that just feel really uncomfortable, not palatable. And so I think that in terms of like yes foods and no foods, like I said, it is so important that we find ways to get our kids' nutrient needs met, but meeting them where they're at in that process. So I always say, like, something is better than nothing. But if we can try to get curious about why it is that our kids like certain things and are really adverse to others, then it can help support how we're going to meet them where they're at and try to find replacements. Or so an example of that could be, like, a lot of kids don't like mixed textures, right? So like a soup, for example, that has chicken in it and noodles in it and harder vegetables. So mixed textures, what would it look like to try and like pull those things apart? If it's they really don't like vegetables, but it's because of how crunchy they are, what would it look like to like cut those vegetables really, really thin? Or so it really is trying to figure out, like, what is my child's specific barrier to eating these foods, and what is it about these foods they really like? Is it the temperature, the smell, the texture? And are there things that I can try to do that replicate that? And in terms of introducing new foods, I always say, like, doing it slowly and safely. And so some kids, again, there is that level of rigidity and this need for predictability because that's safety to them. And so, maybe the first step of introducing new foods is like tongue pricking. So literally, like, not even ingesting it, but like touching it and smelling it and like feeling what it feels like with their tongue. And then the next day or whatever it looks like is having like a really small piece. And it's like trying to introduce new foods, but when they're feeling safe and grounded, so that we're not connecting like fear to the food itself. We want to make food neutral and trying new things feel safe.
Awesome. And so, I know you talked about exploring the textures, trying to be more curious as to why they prefer certain foods over the other. Um, but I've also heard something about, also focusing on bringing them to a regulated state of mind. How would that work? What does that even mean?
So if we are thinking regulation, it kind of goes to the nervous system. So it's really, really common that neurodiverse kids and people in general are sort of functioning in a dysregulated nervous system state. And so that can either be activated or it can be more in like a shutdown state. And both of those are actually survival states. And so trying to bring a kid into regulation often does start with the parent, because parents co-regulate their kids. We all co-regulate each other, right? But trying to bring the child into regulation, often we can do that with certain exercises that use our senses or our breath. And so one example, and one that I really like, I use with clients a lot, is called 5-4-3-2-1. And I do think a lot of parents have heard of this, but it's the 5 senses. So when we're dysregulated, it's really kind of this out of body experience. And so we're not using all of our senses, though one can be really hyperactive. And so if we try to ground before a meal or before trying something new, it could be, let's sit down together. What are 5 things we can see in our surroundings, right? And pay attention to like the color of them. What are 4 things that we can feel right now? So it could be, I feel my feet on the ground. I feel my shirt on my shoulders. What are 3 things that I can hear? What are 2 things that I can smell? And we can like move, right? I can smell my hair, I can smell my clothes. And what's 1 thing we can taste? And often that's like water, saliva, toothpaste, nothing. And that's okay. But we're just trying to bring the kid back into their body through their 5 senses, because that does afford us a much more regulated state. Or breathing. So our breath is really one way that we connect all of our nervous system states. So naturally, when we're activated, our breathing picks up. We've all experienced this before in moments of stress. So one of the ways we can use that to try to come down would be slower breath. And so I really like box breathing because a lot of kids also look kind of like a visual. And so that can look like, let's count together, or I'll count you, right? So it's 4 seconds or 4 or 3, depending on what's comfortable for the kid. But 3 or 4 or 5 in, can we hold it for the same amount of time? Can we breathe out for that time? Can we hold out for that time? Right? So we're sort of, again, coming into a more regulated state. There's something consistent that we can like visualize, which can be really satisfying for neurodiverse kids. And so again, trying to come back into the body, because from that regulated state, trying new things is going to feel safer, or even just eating their safe foods, like eating from that regulated state starts to allow food to feel safer and allows them to digest the food better. Because again, that like gut brain connection, if we're eating from a dysregulated state, or we eat and then right away we're back in dysregulation, our gut is really under resourced.
Okay. Let's pivot now to another very common topic, diet versus supplementation. What do you believe the relationship between supplementation and getting the right or the much needed nutrients from diet is? Because, for example, a lot of people have a cocktail of supplements that they're giving their kids or that they're even taking. And so what is that relationship? How do we balance it out? How do we know that we're not overdoing one over the other?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that the definition of like supplements is really important first. So differentiating between nutrient supplements, so like vitamins and minerals, and other types of supplements, like holistic supplements, like example, like ashwagandha or something. And so if the child, or again, this is like any person, right, but isn't getting the nutrient needs met that we need for like our core building blocks, then part of meeting that child where they're at in that given time could potentially be nutrient supplementation. But if this need over here, the nutrient core building blocks, isn't being met, and then there's these other like holistic modality supplements coming in, then that's not something I would default to first. I think we're kind of missing like the core piece. So, and not that I'm against like those holistic modalities or supplements, but coming back to the core, coming back to the basics is really important. So ideally, we're getting all of our nutrients from diet, right? But that might not be the reality of where each child's at. And we can be on a plan and a journey to trying to get there. But if there's really just fundamental pieces missing, then nutrient supplementation to kind of be a bridge until hopefully we're at a place where we can get it from diet is something that I would be in support of. Just because if we're missing core vitamins or minerals, that's an issue, right? And that can be leading a lot of the time to some of like the heightened behavioral complications that we might be experiencing.
Awesome. And so looking at yes foods and no foods again, are there really no foods, or are there foods that we should try to minimize in our children's diets as much as possible? Like we hear about processed foods or ultra processed. Like, are there certain categories that we as parents should aim, minimizing as much as humanly possible?
I think that when it comes to yes foods and no foods, we can look at it logically in terms of there's, again, these really vital nutrients we need as human beings. And so we don't want nutritionally dense foods to chronically be replaced by processed foods that don't offer those nutrients. But I try to remain in a place of food neutrality. So rather than it being about restriction, so these are off the table, I think of addition, because that's how we neutralize foods. So let's just like pick chips as an example, which could be considered a processed food, that can be really satisfying for the kid, right? Because it's salty and it's crunchy and it's predictable. But it's rather than being like, this is so bad, this is off the table, it's, is there anything we can add alongside these chips that might offer something similar, that might start to neutralize it? So we're not kind of stepping into that food dichotomy, because maintaining a neutral relationship with food, I believe, is important for everyone, but it's especially important for neurodiverse kids, because it's very common that they can, with that rigidity mindset, swing into really strong beliefs around food, right? So I'm good if I eat these, I'm bad if I eat these.
Mm-hmm.
I think like the precedent should always be placed on food neutrality. But yeah, being aware of the fact that ideally we're finding ways to meet the basic needs nutritionally. And then if those other foods are kind of in addition to that, then I do think that is okay, because that's sort of a natural part of just where we're at.
Right. And in our current life and society, there's a huge diet culture where people are, gluten free and casein free and dairy free and vegan and this and that, and how it's great to stop all carbs and be ketogenic and that boosts the brain. What is your take on diet culture?
I think that diet culture is extremely damaging to all people. I think that when our worth is equated to the foods we're eating, where we really can start to struggle with self-worth in general. A lot of the time it's, our sense of motivation or capacity to care for self are attached to these really rigid food rules, which I don't think is ever helpful. I think that we've been really taken out of the world of intuitive eating, which is where our body communicates to us what feels good and what doesn't feel good. And we're all hardwired for health. And so as long as we are learning to regulate and listen to the body, and this comes with time and age, of course, but our bodies generally crave balanced eating. And that's not to say that those fun foods aren't in addition to that, but our body has the wisdom to know if we're not eating any balanced meals or they're all replaced with processed foods, we're not going to feel good, right? And so I think that diet culture, in terms of cutting out food groups or essential nutrients, really can end up leading to malnutrition a lot of the time. It can end up damaging our relationship with food and keeping us stuck in a diet cycle, kind of, right? Where we're kind of all or nothing with this plan, but it's not sustainable. We're off the bandwagon, and we kind of just get stuck in this loop, which I really think can impact, again, self-worth and confidence. And so that's where I'm always harping on food neutrality, right? And so, and then when it comes to cutting out casein or gluten or dairy, I mean, there are people that have food intolerances, right? And so listening to the body is part of that, and getting curious about what actually feels good and doesn't. But I always say, again, regulation. So let's come into a regulated space. Let's offer trust to our body and trust to food. And then if we do continue to see very real gut issues crop up, then that's a little bit more reliable evidence that this food might actually not be great for us in terms of our bodies having a hard time digesting it.
Mm-hmm.
Is cutting out food kind of as this blanket thing, when it might not be necessary.
Okay, awesome. Now moving to the last question. If you had one nugget or advice that you could leave for our parents here or those who will listen to this recording, what would that nugget of advice be?
I think it would be I've sort of already touched, I think, a lot on like regulation today. That's usually my biggest piece, but I think I've kind of touched on that. So I think it would be just like getting curious about your kid's experience, even though I know that can feel challenging and even frustrating at times. But I often say that the things that we experience or your kids are experiencing, there's some root to that, right? Or some seed. So just getting curious about what their experience is, right? So again, I kind of preface this, but like, what is it about this food that you really like? What is it about this thing that you really don't like? Sometimes we might find out that, you know, a kid is really afraid, again, of trying something new. And it's not about the food at all. Or a kid is really afraid of not liking something and getting sick. A lot of neurodiverse kids are afraid of like physically getting sick. So what if I don't like the thing and I get sick? So just trying to get curious, and it might take time, but just try to get to the root of it. Because once we get to the root, there's a lot more capacity to actually find those strategies to work with the barriers that are coming up, rather than it being like a one size fits all, because it's just simply not. Every kid's barriers and rationale for the barriers are different.
Awesome. No, I think that that is definitely something new that I learned today is rather than figuring out, oh, they just don't like broccoli and they don't like cauliflower, they don't like cantaloupe. Figure out what it is about the things they like, the texture, the smell, whatever it is, and try to find a way to explore that for them so that they can get on the same bandwagon of eating healthier options. Awesome. Does anybody have any questions for Amber? We're done with all our questions. Does anybody want to ask Amber any questions?
Hello?
Yes. Hi,
Hello?
Doris.
Me? Hi, Amber. So I have a question back to the topic about the supplement. So I read through some maybe forum or some other like platform. So my kid actually have some sleep difficulties. So I just want to know, in your perspective, um, do you think like supplement like tart cherries really help with sleeping? Because I know my son pretty not possible to eat thousands of tart cherry.
Mm-hmm.
I know real food is better, but yeah, some kind of like chemical or nutrition which helps sleep is actually come from that. But it's 1,000 of it if he need to eat the real fruits. But from supplement, maybe just one capsule. So I'm just thinking, what is your perspective about like eating supplement like that?
Um, and you mentioned the supplement is tart cherry.
Yeah, it's
Okay.
only one chemical inside. Like actually, the brain will like produce that chemical when the room is dark. It's
Mhm.
telling you to go to sleep, but ASD kids just do not produce enough that kind of chemical in their brain. That's why they have sleep difficulties. But
Yeah.
actually, like a capsule will like bring the level of that chemical up, and then they can like fall asleep much easier.
So I think that if you like, have you found that there's actually been a benefit? Have you seen a positive change in your child's sleep taking the tart cherry?
I haven't started yet. I'm just thinking of it because usually the doctor will say no, usually go for the real fruits, but it's not possible to eat thousand of it. So I'm
Yeah.
just thinking in this kind of situation, will do you think this help or like still go for like the real fruits instead
Right.
of one specific chemical in the fruit?
Right. And I would say it's like, even versus it being a chemical, I think in a tart cherry supplement, it's like the concentrated nutrient, right? So it is like melatonin content in a tart cherry supplement, I believe.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but if we again go back to the kind of core building blocks, the core building blocks of hormones are amino acids, so protein. So not that I'm against supplementing, and it is really common actually that neurodiverse kids do benefit from a small dose of melatonin to sleep, because you're right, there is evidence to support that they don't produce enough. It's also important though to look at like the protein content that child is getting in any given day, because we still need to make our own melatonin to help support like sustainability of sleep. So I think that especially if it was recommended by a GP or someone who's overseeing the dose and the progress of taking that supplement, I don't see any negative, I guess, outcome of taking it. The way we produce that melatonin naturally, again, is going to be having enough protein and all just in general having enough micronutrients, right? But if we're doing all we can in that arena and we're still struggling with sleep, then having the support of a little bit of extra melatonin that can be supportive for a lot of kids, and it has been really supportive for a lot of the people that I've talked with. But take it day by day and see what actually is helping your kid and not helping your kid, because again, it's different for everybody.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Does anybody else?
Thank you.
Oh, awesome. Does anybody else have any other questions? Okay. Thank you so much, Amber. It's been so great hearing from you and learning a lot. And I think everybody's learned so much today on stuff that we could do and we could probably think about and we can research more on. On the last segment, because we have just about 10 minutes left, I promised that I would share some recipe ideas that really worked for my kids, that I had to research over time, just having to bring in healthier options into their meals. Something that Amber said that I was really happy she mentioned, because I didn't know if this was right, was really looking at textures, exploring textures. And I found that one of my sons, he loves cold things. He will not drink warm water. He had to have it with ice. And we were struggling with getting him to drink smoothies. So one of the things that I thought about in the summertime is, why not make smoothie popsicles, like freeze them, create popsicles out of it. And he can get all the ice he wants, all the cold sensations he wants. And he's still having fruits and he's still getting that fiber in. So I would make a regular smoothie, freeze it in a popsicle container, and he would have like 4 of that in a day. Another thing for vegetables was he likes crunchy things. He likes chicken nuggets, but he liked I would see him eat the breading of the chicken nugget crust and discard the chicken. And so I started replicating broccoli that way. I started making crispy broccoli for him, and that became his new snack. And then chocolate chip cookies, they just like having very crispy cookies with the chocolate chips. So taking out regular flour, because I found that he would have inflammation in his gut whenever he had anything with regular flour. And I substituted that with almond flour. And so I've put together some recipes that I'm happy to share with this group, just so that you guys could try as you explore the different reasons why your kids love certain things. And if it's something that appeals to you, feel free to use. I'll send an email afterwards with all of these so that you guys can use them. Last bit, does anybody have any questions that they want to ask before we are done today? And please feel free to ask any questions. And coming. All right. Well, that's the end of our info session. Thank you so much for joining us. Amber, thank you so much for being here, for sharing your expertise with us. And for every parent that joined, thank you. Like I said, the session is recorded and I'll share it so that everyone has access to it. And I hope you guys all have a great rest of your day. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Julia.
Bye.